Great, thanks everyone. Happy to see so many people here. So my talk today will be around why GraphQL is more than a type system. There's a lot of, well, I've been giving talks around GraphQL for the past maybe 4 or 5 years, and it's great to see so many people already are using GraphQL if I've heard about it. But I think around social media there's also conversations going on. When you shoot GraphQL, is GraphQL your best solution? Do you actually need it? And in this talk I want to give you some background on why you might need it, but also why you might not need it, and how using GraphQL somehow can be overhead, but it can also help you in future. So I think as a software developer I like to say it depends. The same as with every technology. When using GraphQL it also depends. So first of all, thank you for having me here in Singapore. It's great to see all of you here. So I did a workshop on Wednesday, I think. So thank you for everyone joining there. If you joined the workshop, you're also almost speaking at a conference now. You already made it to the slides. So it's the first step in maybe next year or at a different conference. Try yourself and speak for an audience like this. And also great to see so many of the other speakers and sponsors yesterday. A little bit about myself. As Dan said, my name is Roy. I'm from Amsterdam, so a pretty long flight. I think it was like 12 hours. As I said to someone, hopefully one day I will make enough money to fly business class so I don't have to sit in a chair and hurt my neck. But, well, maybe one day. I work for a product now called StepZen, which is a solution to make building GraphQL APIs easier. I also write programming books, mostly around React or TypeScript or GraphQL. So hopefully these are technologies you're familiar with as well. And I create videos on YouTube and go to conferences like this. So if after these 30 minutes you haven't seen enough of me, just make sure to go to YouTube and you can find more. Or just speak to me whenever you find me working around here. So the first question I'd say is, why do developers love GraphQL? And it's a question I usually ask people when they do a workshop or when they ask me questions around using GraphQL in their products. I guess the main reason for GraphQL to become popular one day was, as a front-end developer, I really hate interacting with REST APIs. So who here hates using REST APIs? Or who sometimes dislikes it? Maybe dislikes is more polite. Well, I'm guessing you're just being polite. As a front-end developer, my main problem was when I was learning the front-end development or learning to work on a front-end project, I was using REST APIs. And one thing I always hated was it's really unclear what you can find where. You have all these different endpoints. How do you call them? How do you find your data? How do you get data that's missing? As a front-end developer, it would be easier just to have one API that gives you all the data you need, which is exactly what GraphQL does. So let me quickly browse through this. As I saw from the small poll we did, most of you already know GraphQL or are even using it, so we can make this part quick, but it's good to have the full context before I'm going to bore you with more complicated details. So GraphQL is what we call a query language for APIs. I have a slide somewhere where I say GraphQL is like SQL. I guess most of you know SQL. Even though you might be a front-end developer, you sometimes have to interact with a database. And SQL is, well, a query language for a database, where GraphQL is something I like to call a query language for APIs. It looks a bit like this. You usually have a request that consists of multiple parts. We like to call this a document that you send to a GraphQL API, which contains sort of all the info you want from the API. And this is what you see on the left, and what you see on the right is the actual response. You can also see from how it's described. Your request, which you see on the left, has the same structure as your response, which you get on the left, which you get on the right. And this is something I always hated about REST. You send a request to a REST API, and you usually have no clue what will come back. You're pretty sure it's JSON. With GraphQL, you also get JSON. But with a REST API, you don't really know the information you're receiving, whereas with GraphQL, you can just send a request, you define it in the way you like, and you will get a request in the same format. Usually, you even get the same structure of order. So if you're maybe a developer that likes to have their data in order, then this could be very helpful. I like to say you ask what you need and you get exactly that. If you grew up in the 90s like me, you might know the Spice Girls song. So you tell GraphQL what you really, really want, and you will get exactly what you really, really want from the GraphQL API. It is, well, like I said, if you grew up in the 90s, it's pretty cool. I even see a Buzz Lightyear t-shirt there, so it really means it's from the 90s. So GraphQL is a query language for APIs, and it also does, and this is the main reason for me at least to use GraphQL, it offers me a single endpoint for all my resources. So the thing I hate about REST, and it's fine if you say dislike instead of hate, or maybe you find it slightly uncomfortable to use a REST API, also okay with me. It offers a single endpoint for all your resources. So if you work with a lot of different data, you have data coming from databases, REST APIs, maybe multiple tables in a database, or maybe completely separate systems, REST APIs can be quite terrible, especially if they all use their own convention, their own sort of way to name things or structure things. With GraphQL, it's slightly different. So on the screen, you can see an example of a GraphQL version of a Twitter or X, I guess you call it X today, version of their API. They have typical REST API, so they like to structure their data by data entity, meaning that every table in their database will have a separate REST endpoint. They obviously will do some sort of abstraction to make your life a bit easier, but they don't do it completely. One of the things they don't do is if you send a request to the Twitter REST API endpoint to get all the tweets containing the word Einstein or Singapore or City.js, you will get a list of all the tweets containing this keyword. What they don't give you is the name of the author of the tweet. And this is because they have this REST API that is structured based on data entity. So they will have a relationship identifier to this author, like an author ID, or I'm not sure what their internal naming usage is, but the person that wrote this particular tweet. But they won't give you the name, meaning that in a REST API, you always have to send 2 separate requests to this API to get all the data you need instead of just one. So I created a GraphQL version of this API, and as you can see, I have created this nested relationship where I can get both all the tweets containing a keyword and also the user that wrote this tweet. So this is something that most GraphQL APIs will solve for you. You have one single request instead of all these separate requests. As mentioned, this is one of the key reasons for me to use GraphQL, and I will highlight this further later on as well. But this always bothered me when working with REST APIs, having to send all these different requests, needing to await. I remember when I started writing JavaScript, it might be 15 years ago, I was using jQuery, and it was pretty hard to stitch API results together. It was even harder as we didn't really have async await, so you sort of got lost in promise hell. I hope most of you don't remember promise hell, but it was pretty terrible, and REST APIs definitely helped you to get stuck in there. And finally, it's based on a type system. So who in here is using TypeScript? Oh, nice, quite a few of you. So one of the things I also dislike about REST APIs is it doesn't have a type system. It's really hard to create types for the data you have in there. If someone changes the REST API endpoints or its response or the structure, you will have to retype your types. If you start using a new REST API endpoint, you have to create more types. So GraphQL is based on the type system itself. So not only do you get type safety in all your requests, you can also use this later on. This means that if you're interacting with a GraphQL API, and tooling is also an important reason for me to use GraphQL, it brings you a sort of visual way to discover your API, also to work with it. And typically in there you can find a visualized version of a GraphQL schema. So this schema is where the type safety comes from. And you can see a visual representation in most of these API tools. It used to be quite hidden because if you wanted to work with GraphQL, you needed to use Graphical, which was sort of a built-in JavaScript library where you could interact with the API. I think today most sort of API tools, even Postman, they have integration for GraphQL, so you can have auto-completion when you send a request, or they will give you a visualized version of the schema. So I see more and more API tools to start working with GraphQL, which is great. So it improves developer experience. I guess that is sort of my main reason to use it, because as I said, I don't really like REST APIs. They have particular things I don't like or even hate, and GraphQL will solve these. Not only by being a query language or having one endpoint for all these resources, or by being so generous in giving us all this tooling, it most of all improves my developer experience. And tooling like this, so this is GraphQL, is one of the reasons it improves my developer experience. It's not only the tool, it's also the schema you have, the auto-completion you get here, and having one single endpoint instead of needing to stitch all these things together. And also, the type system is quite important for me, because I like to work with TypeScript when I build a front end. And GraphQL can also be your BFF. So this is not best friends forever, but this is also your backend for front end. If you are a front end developer, maybe in a large or slightly large company, you probably have a backend for front end. You maybe work on one part of the application, or maybe you work on one of the 10 applications they're developing in-house. You probably have a backend for front end. And GraphQL can be this complete backend for front end. I will iterate a bit more later on, but it's really good to see that you can have one API format instead of 6 different ones. So when you use GraphQL, I guess this is the main reason I gave this talk, because as I mentioned in the beginning, I guess there's maybe some discussions around it, or maybe some unclarities around when to use GraphQL and when not to use GraphQL. I guess one of the main reasons to use GraphQL is, as I mentioned, multiple clients using the same data. Imagine you have this one API, you have this database containing your customer data or maybe orders. I used to work in e-commerce a lot, so you can find a lot of the examples I create are around orders and customers and products. It's, I guess it's a habit of working with all these different e-commerce projects. So multiple clients using the same data is a very good reason to use GraphQL. Imagine you have this one API that serves multiple clients. It could be a web app, it could be a mobile app, it could be different mobile apps, it could maybe even be white labeled apps. If one of you ever worked on a company that created white label applications, you probably really need GraphQL, because all these white label applications might need a slightly different version of an API. So for this, GraphQL is great, as it will give you one way to access all this data from all these different clients. And as I told you, you can use GraphQL in any way you want, and you can tell GraphQL what you want. So if one of those clients have different needs of data, and this data is present in the GraphQL API, they can use the same API without being constrained with what the other applications are doing. And this is a very good reason to use GraphQL, because REST APIs, they're static, they have a fixed data structure. If you add a new field to a REST API response, all these different clients will get the same field. And usually I like to give this background, like GraphQL was created by Facebook, and they open sourced it in 2015, but they came up with the idea already in 2012. And the main reason to do it was actually this reason. They were scaling across all of the different countries in the world. They were scaling across countries where they have different needs in terms of bandwidth. So I guess today we don't really care anymore about loading data on your phone, because data is kind of free. You have your mobile phone plan and you get usually as much data as you want, or quite close. I guess I have like a pretty small bundle of like 20 gigabytes, but still I don't really use it up because I'm on Wi-Fi half of the time. So we don't really care much about data anymore. When GraphQL was created, we cared a lot about our data usage, which was mainly because of cost, because you had limited bandwidth on your phone, but also your phone wasn't able to process if all this data you sent to your phone if you would send too much data. Today we don't really care anymore, which I guess it's also a bad thing. I did a talk once at a conference around how your bundle size is sort of bad for the climate. I like to say REST APIs could be bad for the climate as well. If you're not thinking about the data you're sending all this data to a phone or a computer. Every time it needs to be processed, it needs to be transferred from data center to data center. It's something people don't really think about anymore, but it could be a nice topic for maybe a next slide. So another good reason to use GraphQL is you have data in multiple places. And I guess this is mostly a topic for maybe a bit more for backend developers. Are there any backend developers here? A few. Are there any full stack developers? Okay, that's a bit more, that's good. So let's suppose we have some developers working with backends, and you might imagine that sometimes all these backends have their different API, or they have their different way to interact with them. With GraphQL, you can have one unified way of interacting with all these different backends. So this one GraphQL API doesn't care if you have data coming from an API developed internally, externally, a database maybe running MySQL versus a database maybe running Postgres, or even one of those newer database formats, maybe like a NoSQL database that already comes with GraphQL support. I guess there's lots of different opportunities here. I also like to say it's not only about having data in multiple places, it's also around having data that is exposed in different programming languages. So maybe a part of your company is building in JavaScript, a different part is building in Python or Go, or maybe even PHP or Java. If you have all these different programming languages, you probably need one unified way to access all this data, because otherwise, well, you sort of get stuck in having to interact with all these different frameworks. So for 1 and 2, I'd like to say GraphQL can be used as a data layer. So I remember GraphQL can be your BFF, whether that's best friend forever. I guess GraphQL and I are best friends forever since I started working with it somewhere around 2016, so pretty early on. But most of all, you use it as your backend for frontend. And I also like to say it's backend for front ends, as we saw it's really good for having multiple clients. So data access layer is a pretty normal term in computer science. I like to say it's a layer or a computer program that provides simplified access to data stored somewhere. So it's data stored somewhere, so it could be a database, could be an API, it could even be a JSON file you might be exposing from your computer. I guess most projects starts with a JSON file that you load instead of interacting with a REST API, because you need to find a way to mock this data. So you might also think a data access layer, it's a simplified way to access data from persistent storage. It's pretty much like an API, right? Because APIs are doing the same thing. They give you simplified access to data stored usually in a database. I like to say it's a bit like like this movie. It's a great movie. I guess the right person is now also an Oppenheimer, which you still need to see. But the thing I like here in this movie, they're going in a dream, inside a dream, inside a dream, inside a dream. I guess if you work with GraphQL, you're sometimes also stacking APIs, because you're building an API on top of your already existing APIs. So it could get dangerous there. It's one thing to know. But as most of your front-end developers, you probably don't really care about that part anymore. You just cared about having a good API that works for all your different data needs and different clients. So this data layer for GraphQL would pretty much look like this. You're stacking APIs, right? So you have this API that's already developed by someone in your company or maybe by yourself, and you start to create a GraphQL layer on top of it. It could also be inside your front-end app. That's perfectly fine. I see this happening all the time, especially with all these great front-end frameworks offering you ways to create like API routes inside the framework directly. So this could be a good way to create your GraphQL API there. One caveat, which we'll handle in a bit, but a data layer will look like this. And let's say it also scales across different clients. It doesn't scale if you create it inside your Next.js or Remix app, but if you create it as a separate entity, it scales across all these clients. And this is a bit like the backend for front ends part, right? So we have one API that we use across all the different clients, and if this is GraphQL, it doesn't really matter what's underneath. So it works with decoupled backends as well. As most of you are in backend developers, let's be quick about this part. But I like to say it's also great for this setup where you would have all these different programming languages inside your company. Like I said, developers building with Python, JavaScript, Go, Java. If you need a unified way to access all these different APIs and you sort of get in trouble with your other developers, like which programming language do we use to create this gateway or access layer for a company, then GraphQL can be great because there are many ways to create GraphQL APIs based on your existing data without having to create all this custom code every time. So each API service will have their own graph. And this is something we call GraphQL federation. I won't bore you with all the details, but if you are a backend developer and you're interested in GraphQL, make sure to have a look at whatever you can do there. And something else that sort of comes for free, and I like to say it comes for free when using GraphQL because it might not be the main reason to use it. With TypeScript, you can create type safety for your API. We have this schema. TypeScript has its own type system. If you're a bit of a type nerd, like myself, I can be a bit of a type nerd. Maybe I shouldn't be using TypeScript because there are better type programming languages, but TypeScript is doing a great job for me as a former JavaScript developer. It will help you to create type safety, meaning that if you have this data layer and you're using it from your clients, you can generate types based on whatever is in this data layer. So this can give you end-to-end type safety, even though your ends might not be type safe, especially the far, let's say, right end, depending how you would create your diagrams. I like to say even if your API giving you access to your database data isn't type safe, if you create a data access layer that's type safe, you can still get quite near to end-to-end type safety, which I'd say is like the holy grail of full stack development. So if you're a full stack developer, type safety will really help you, especially end-to-end type safety, because there's nothing worse than having an API that's being changed without you knowing it on the front end, or front end needs changing without, or data needs changing without you knowing as a backend developer. Brings me to the third point, why developers love GraphQL, and when you should use it. It might also be when you need a type system. And I guess this one we should really cross out, because if you're looking at GraphQL to get a type system, or at least type safety for your front ends, I guess most of the times you're looking at the wrong place. And this is also where all the discussions on Twitter or X are going on. People have been using GraphQL for a long time because they had this problem where they didn't get type safety in their front-end apps from REST, so they started looking at other things like GraphQL, which is good because it has a type system, it has a schema, you can generate types, so nothing wrong with that, but there are still things you might be missing or things you might be sort of over-engineering when using GraphQL. So let's look at a typical setup. I'm not really sure how I'm doing in terms of time, so maybe if someone could help me with that. So let's look at a typical setup today. We have a front-end application, could be mobile, could be web, could be both. Maybe it's like a hybrid one. You have a database. And this database exposed through an API. If you have this setup, I'd like to call this a one-to-one relationship with your backend or with your data. You have one end user and you have one sort of provider of your data. So if you want to change code to this project, it's pretty easy. You change the backend part, you change the front-end part, and you're pretty much settled. If you want to have type safety between the two, you need to make changes in both, because you're changing the backend part, you need to change the front-end part, update types, and whatnot. If you're using GraphQL for this, it's still the same. You change your GraphQL schema when you have new data, and you might need to update things on the front-end side to sort of iterate on this new data. The sort of annoying part is when you use GraphQL, GraphQL doesn't have TypeScript support out of the box. It means you need to use a library. So GraphQL code generator is great for this, for example, to generate TypeScript types based on your backend. So every time you change your backend, you need to change it in multiple places. You change your backend, you regenerate the types, you then start consuming it from your front end. If you have multiple clients, you need to regenerate all these clients in order to get the latest set of types. So this is sort of, well, it's okay if you have a large company, if you have CI/CD pipelines, if you have testers, it's okay and you get all the advantages of GraphQL. If you're a single developer, or maybe a small team of developers in a startup working on this one-to-one entity, it's not the most ideal situation. You need to generate types, you need to make changes in multiple systems. So is it really the best solution? And this is where all the discussion is going on, is going about. So it really depends, I'd say. If you're a GraphQL lover like myself, I probably will keep using GraphQL even until I die. So It really depends, but gRPC might be a better option for you if you have this solution where you have one backend, you have one client using it. With gRPC, you get a framework to build TypeScript APIs. They are sort of type safe by nature. So if you make changes to your data or your data layer, those will be reflected in your client as well. So when you're accessing the data, you don't even have to type types because it's all sort of implicit, as types are defined only once, which is sort of at the data level. So if you have this one-to-one entity, I'd say use gRPC if you want to use TypeScript. And there's one caveat though: if you are hoping to scale in the future, you should think about any opportunity cost you might have when needing to refactor all this to GraphQL if you have multiple clients, if you start to have multiple programming languages, if you decide to, I don't know, maybe white label your application. As a startup, things are moving fast. gRPC helps you to move fast and break things, but I don't think it scales that good if you are getting multiple programming language in the future. I have a video on YouTube around this. It will probably help you to find out if gRPC is better for you than GraphQL. I can give probably an entire talk around this topic. Maybe I will do next time. So it's great for one-to-one setups, which maybe most of you are working on, maybe some of you are working on in your side projects, and especially when they need to be type safe. So back to GraphQL. So GraphQL is best for if you have like a one-to-many, so where you have one backend that serves multiple clients, or when you have multiple backends serving multiple clients. Because there you would really benefit from having this one solution for all your data, no matter where it resides or how you're using it. It's something else I really like, and this will be the end of this talk. It's a declarative language. And I told you in the beginning, it's a bit like SQL for APIs. So it's a declarative language like SQL. And SQL was actually my first sort of introduction to programming, because I was working with some open source software to build an e-commerce platform, and I needed to sort of change the data I got on my application. And the best way to do this was by changing a SQL query, because it sort of automatically changed my APIs. So SQL is what you see on the right. Probably most of you are familiar with SQL. And in SQL, you sort of define the fields you want to receive. So you can say select name and email from this database where this condition is equal to whatever. This is what you see on the right. So I like to say this is declarative because you're not telling SQL how to do it. You're only telling SQL what to do. And if you look on the left, you can see GraphQL. You're pretty much doing the same thing. You're using this GraphQL schema definition language or this GraphQL query language to define you want to have a customer that matches with this parameter that says email is equal to johndoe@example.com and return these fields for me. So it's also very declarative. You're not telling GraphQL how to do it, you're only telling it what to do. So this being a declarative language is really easy for developers, because you don't really have to know how GraphQL works, you just need to know slightly a little bit on how to interact with the API and how to get data out of it. I guess for SQL, most people don't really know how SQL works, or don't really get past this sort of select statement with a join. Does anyone know the difference between a left join, inner join, right join, these kind of things? I don't, honestly, but I sort of try them all and see which performs better. But I'm not a database expert. And I guess most developers are database experts. So that's where a declarative language comes in handy. So it's easy to work for developers, but it's also easy to work with for other systems. And for this, I like to say it's also easy to work with for AI or generative AI. They don't need to know how GraphQL works in detail. They only need to know how to interact with it on sort of a global level. So one of the projects we're working on internally, and I tweeted this a couple of days ago, I hope all of you are working on projects internally for your company or in a side project around something with AI or generative AI. I hope you're exploring what it can do for you as a developer, what it can do for you as a company, because in my opinion it will be the real next big thing for all of us. So I hope you're exploring and trying it out on your own as well. So GraphQL, as it has a declarative language, it can also be easy to interface to this language from other tools, such as AI. So let's say you would have a prompt asking to some system, when will my package arrive? If you ask this prompt to OpenAI or maybe any sort of ChatGPT thing, they don't really know what to do. If you ask this to a GraphQL client that doesn't really know what to do as well, it's still the same question. So when will my package arrive? If a generative AI or LLM system doesn't have real knowledge of a GraphQL API, they would still be able to generate queries based on the schema. So the GraphQL schema will always be exposed on every API. So the only thing the generative AI needs to know is how to write a query and how to sort of read the schema. So if you have an agent, which could be using GraphQL, that knows how to get data out of databases, how to get data out of APIs, it would be able to translate your prompt into a GraphQL query. And you don't really need rocket science for this. It's a declarative language. So in my feeling, it really gives us opportunities to build new cool things. So based on whatever data GraphQL can get out of you, the agent would be able to retrieve this information from the GraphQL API and then give you back the information. And I know there's more talks around AI today, so if you aren't using any of this today, make sure to read into it and make sure you, well, at least explore it. I like to say it's not a threat, it's an opportunity. It's only a threat if you don't know what's going on. So this is a more complicated setup. I will share this maybe on Twitter just because I'm running out of time and I want to be respectful to the next speakers as well. So to recap, the reason I think you should use GraphQL, it's great because it's a query language for APIs, a bit like SQL. It's declarative, which creates opportunities for the future. It offers you a single endpoint for all these different resources. So if you're working with different databases, different services, different APIs, and you want one way to play with all of them and get data from it, GraphQL is really your go-to thing. It has great tooling and it's based on a type system. But as I mentioned, it might not be the best solution if you're only looking for a type system, especially if you're working with one-to-one relationships where you have one client and one API. So GraphQL is great for multiple APIs, multiple clients, these kind of setup. Otherwise, you might be best looking at something like gRPC. And the declarative language is not only easy to work with for developers, but also for other systems and potentially even AI. So this gives great opportunities to keep using GraphQL for all your data while building on top some great generative AI solutions. So that's it. Thank you all, and I hope we can stay in touch either on Twitter or in this conference because we have a full day ahead of us. So thank you, and I hope you learned some new things.